Thanks a lot for that warm welcome. I'm delighted to be here finally to experience the Toronto Spring I've heard so much about. Thank you particularly to Diane for giving me an extra coat and a scarf to cope with this emergency layers. If you want to follow me or tweet at me or argue with me on Twitter as we go through, then you can follow me at Ant London. At Ant London, so short for Anthony London. And I'll get back to you after this. So I think I just wanted to start off really by taking a step back and looking at the broader context, because the context we're all operating in today from a global perspective is quite concerning. We heard the Premier mention some of the challenges that we've got, but we've got a rise in populism across the globe in many countries, including in the UK, certainly just south of here. We've certainly got some of that. And there's also a parallel rise and very connected rise in what I would say is ignorance, a kind of disdain of experts, a disdain of science, and knowledge, and belief also in reputable news media. And then there's also a rise in intolerance, which again is linked to that. So migrants seen as the problem, minorities seen as the problem, and the combination of these three is quite dangerous and quite toxic. Part of the reason why this is happening, I think, and certainly from a UK perspective, we've been doing collectively a lot of soul searching about why people voted for Brexit for different reasons, and clearly there isn't a single reason for that, but it is partly around people feeling powerless over things that happen in their local area, powerless to stop the big economic forces around globalization that means that flows of capital and employment rates are changing around them, and they have little to do to stop that and to create a new way of doing things. And that backlash that lots of people are facing, that kind of looking for easy solutions and the quick way of describing, the quick way of blaming outsiders, other people, is one that people are grasping to. And I think this is where the point of this conference and the point of community hubs is so important in that kind of strategic global way, because the model of a community hub, a community anchor, as we would call it in England, is, I believe, a really important part of challenging that drive and offering an alternative, more positive vision for how we can give people more control over what happens locally, how we can give people the economic levers that happen at a local, place-based view of the world, to be able to be in the driving seat and to try and determine the kind of economic growth that they want to see. So I think it's hugely important. I'm speaking to a very cold room of converts to this and true believers, but I think it's really important that we remember that some of these things that we're saying are so important at the moment, so never more so at the moment. And I think it's particularly encouraging to hear how much support there has been from the provincial government here. It's really positive to hear the Premier talk so passionately about the model and have a track record of being interested in this for so long, because that really does make a difference, I think, in creating a climate. However, it's not all about government at all, and a lot of you, I'm sure, will be trying to give advice and talk about the right kind of balance between government action, government inaction. And I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the ideas and the learning that we have in the UK about what's worked, what hasn't worked so well, and what we think needs to happen as well. So we call in England the kind of community hub model community anchor organisations, and I'll just start off by giving you a little bit of a background over the type of organisations that we would class as community hubs, well, I'll use that term, and a little bit about what locality does to support the community hub agenda. So the evolution of community hubs in England goes back a long time. Before the Victorian age, certainly, we've always had community meeting spaces and community gatherings. We've always had a tradition of community-based action linked to philanthropy. But I'll kind of start in terms of the establishment of the university settlements and neighbourhood centres. In the 1880s, the first one, Toynbee Hall in the East End of London, started a trend for university colleges to set up, on a very philanthropic base, a kind of physical place where students could go and spend a year doing good works with the poor. Very paternalistic approach, but over time, many of those were set up. Many worked in the most disadvantaged places. It spread throughout the UK, and then took off very, very rapidly in Canada, in the US, in lots of European countries too. And in the UK, that tradition really started to change from being paternalistic to campaigning for social reform, introducing elements of the welfare state. So it became quite important as place-based laboratories, I guess, for doing good works. So we have members that have been in existence since the 1880s in our network and have come from that philanthropic type of background. We've also got members who've come from activism, and I'll talk about this a little bit more, but a group of our members came from the 1960s, 1970s, in very disadvantaged areas as a result of equalities campaigning. So lots were led by black and minority ethnic communities to introduce a new focus on the problems that they were facing in their area. They felt that they didn't get attention or priority and funding from the states. A lot of our members, therefore, came from that kind of tradition. And then in the 90s, late 80s, early 90s, we had a wave of organizations set up that were really focused about economic development, about using the economic powers, the levers that existed in a place to drive economic growth, certainly, but to do something quite different, which was to retain the wealth that was generated within a local deprived area. Because in lots and lots of places, people work, people pay into things, people pay taxes for services, and a lot of that money leaks out of the local neighborhood. So a big focus of those development trusts was to try and use enterprise, was to use asset development, buildings and land, to try and generate that kind of local wealth. And then other kind of later initiatives have been around regeneration projects, government programs, and then interestingly, over the last few years, again, we've seen a bit of a renaissance in community activism being the driver for why people want to take part in community hubs. And then the other thing which may be of interest in the context here, which is around also we're now seeing a really big driver for the public sector to have spin-outs, to have worker co-ops, worker mutuals, organisations that come out of the public sector and are now set up as independent non-government agencies, creating that community hub. So we're seeing that in particular in the UK in terms of leisure facilities, in terms of libraries, etc. And I'll talk a little bit about some of the experience that we have. So the community anchor model comes from lots of different backgrounds, but most of them have the similarities of four kind of key foundation blocks of why an anchor in a UK context works. Firstly, they use a strong asset-based. So many of our 600 members will own a building, buildings, land, and use that asset to sweat and generate income. Secondly, they use enterprise a lot. So many of our organisations are charitable organisations, but they also have social enterprise activities. Sometimes that's about renting out rooms, renting out venue space, and making some money like that. And then there are some other more kind of out there, I suppose, examples. There's a jam factory, there's a chocolate factory. The chocolate factory is a great one in an old mining community, and the chief executive of that organisation set up the chocolate factory because he wanted to make cheap chocolate and sell it to bloody idiots down in London. So it was a great example of how you can get money back in from expensive areas back. And there's lots of different examples like that across the network of how people have used different enterprising approaches. Thirdly, the third pillar that underpins lots of the community hubs that we work with is contracts. So many of our members who take part in public sector, public service delivery, take part in the commissioning process and end up with contracts to deliver particular services. It's a huge growth area, it has been for our members, but it is fraught with difficulties. I'm going to explore a couple of those issues too. And then the fourth kind of foundation block is really the more traditional funding base. So kind of grant funding from independent foundations and trusts, grant funding from local authorities, local governments, and then philanthropic giving, which is not so much of a major part of the funding mix for the majority of our members, although it is significant for some of them. So it's about being on that journey of a community anchor organisation. Our members, 600 of them across England, we have sister organisations that cover Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland. So when I talk about the UK, I'm kind of very, very impolitically using that as shorthand for what's happening in England because I'm in a foreign country, so it's acceptable. But the model is the kind of the perfect community anchor organisation would be independent of the different funding streams that can be relied upon. So ideally, the model is to reach the nirvana of not being reliant on government funding, which we all know can come, can go, and is quite difficult. And they focus on being independent from the public sector and from the private sector, whilst being interdependent on both of them. So quite often our members will be one of the major employers in a local area. Some of our members employ hundreds of staff doing lots of different things, and they act as that bridge in terms of local businesses, bringing in external investment into the local area, and doing some things that the public sector just can't do in terms of their kind of charitable outcomes as well. Not all of our members have reached that kind of nirvana, but many of them are on that journey towards it. So I think it's an important thing for us to remember that there are steps on that journey. So what do we do at Locality? Well, we do three things, essentially. We help our members be as strong as they possibly can through a range of different services. We kind of call what we do SOAR, the SOAR model, S-O-A-R. So we help them get started, we help them get organised, we help them start achieving, and then we help them become resilient. So a range of different services across the board on that. Unfortunately, the growth area in England has been the resilient bit, because lots of our members have faced huge problems in terms of differences in contracting relationships, funding falling off a cliff, and also increased demand for services at the same time. So we've been spending a lot of our time doing that kind of thing. We also run national programs and projects. Some of those are focused on supporting our members directly, but actually a number of them are focused on creating a better climate in general for communities to feel more in control over what's happening locally. So two examples are we've run a national program around community organising, and that's a theme that I'll just return to in an example. And then we also run a national program to support communities to get involved in neighbourhood planning, which is a legislative power that communities have to actually have full control over statutory land use planning powers at a neighbourhood level, which is quite an important precedent in terms of the law to shift powers towards communities and away from local government. But the thing I'll focus on is our third kind of key activity, which is about trying to create a positive environment for community hubs to work within. So we know that our members are focused on assets and enterprise, and it's interesting, some of the conversations that have already come out of today's session have been about how communities can use assets, land and buildings, I'm talking about in this context, to greatest effect. And it's interesting that the Premier announced there was this kind of 18-month facility to enable communities to get hold of assets, and that's certainly something we've got some experience on. So what we know from an English perspective is that maybe about 3 years ago, before that, it was like trying to get blood out of a stone, trying to get local government and national government to give up assets to local community organisations. There are legislative powers in England to be able to transfer assets for no market value to community organisations, but getting them to do that was very, very, very difficult indeed. What was generally on offer were liabilities rather than assets. You know, by all means, you can take over this absolutely dilapidated 18th century building that no one's been in for the last 40 years. But if you do take it over, we expect you to fully refurbish it and meet these really, really high bars of health and safety, etc., etc. So that's been a struggle. Since about 3 years ago, that's swung violently to local authorities could not be more happy to get rid of every single bit of property they possibly owned. Many of them coming up with glossy brochures and prospectuses of all the different property they had, but of course the rub was that they wanted market value for this property, which has created an entire distortion of the market. You know, if you want a community centre anywhere in England at the moment, it's a buyer's market. But if you're a community organisation, then obviously it's very difficult to to get the funds and build up the funds. Assets are a really important part of the picture, and one of the reasons why we focus so much on assets for our members, you know, because lots of our members would say, you know, it's not just about the buildings, it's not about the bricks and mortar, it's about what we do and who we interact with. And of course, that's absolutely right. But if you've got an asset at the centre of your operations, if you operate out of a multi-purpose community centre, you're able to generate income, you've got it on your balance sheets, it gives you strength as a community organisation to leverage in other investments and other money. And a piece of research we did over the last couple of years suggested that those who owned their assets have weathered the financial storm since the 2008 economic crisis much better than those who didn't have the asset, because they were able to reconfigure their services, retreat to a smaller footprint, etc. So it's really, really important. Also, we know that assets that are owned by communities can help support local services. There's a great example in Leeds, in Yorkshire, where there was an old Victorian swimming pool, Bramley Baths. It's featured on our website if anybody wants to have a look at it. The local authority basically said this was a very, very run-down local swimming pool. It hadn't really had any substantial investment in it for many decades. They couldn't possibly make it work. It had to be closed. There was a huge local community campaign to keep it open. They believed that actually this was a well-loved local resource. Very true. They got lots and lots of local people using it all the time in a very, very deprived area, very few other leisure facilities anywhere nearby. As a result of that national campaign, the local authority decided in the end to give them a long lease on the running of it, and within 9 months they turned a profit in terms of the operation of that swimming pool, had reopened it, had cleansed it, put on loads of different extra facilities. It was open later, just because they ran it in a completely different way to the local authority, and it was for local people by local people. A whole range of other examples like that, and you can check that out on our website about how communities have done that in response to a threat around an asset as well as the positive. But we know, as I said before, assets can be liabilities. We also know that you can't just say to a local community organisation, we're going to close this facility next month or in 6 months. It's over to you if you want to do anything to it. We've seen that particularly in the library sector, where lots of local authorities have decided, because of pressures, they can no longer run library services. Where it has not worked well is where they've just kind of said, we're closing the doors, over to you, anybody who wants it can have it, basically. It tends to then have to fall on a few committed volunteers to try and make the whole thing work, with limited expertise of how to do stuff, with no oversight and professional librarian support, hugely valuable profession in this, and you do end up actually with lots of people being completely burnt out after a few months and the doors closing anyway. Where it's worked well, and it has worked extremely well in some cases, is where a local authority has started to think about this a long time ahead, build the capacity of the local community and work with them in terms of ongoing support, ongoing funding to do a slow transition and into the community sector. And then we've been helping lots of those community libraries by also trying to diversify what they do. So the most successfully run community libraries are now well used. They also have community cafes, they have health services coming out of them, they have a whole range of other hubs. And lots of our existing members have now taken on library services and hosted them as part of their wraparound services. So they're able to have the library service where there is youth provision, children and family provision, etc. So it's much more integrated, exactly the kind of community hub model we've all been talking about. It's a difficult area for us as an organisation because we don't want to be there saying it's fine for the public sector to stop delivering all of these services and to cut, actually, but we're pragmatic in terms of, well, if it is going to be cut, then we need to help people do that transition. So we kind of have a little bit of a tightrope and often get angry letters from librarians. So if there are any librarians here who want to shout at me, I'm well used to it, so we can do it. Good, the librarian, massive is over there. So the key lessons around the assets kind of agenda, I think, is that it does need to be a genuine partnership. Support and funding do need to be available. It can't just happen without a transitional support and without building up that capacity and capability. And we've also had legislation that's been supportive. So we have the Localism Act 2011. One of the things that did was create a community right to bid for assets that are deemed to be of community value. So it introduced a process for communities to be able to, A, register a community of value. So you can go through a process and get a certificate and saying that this building, this asset is an asset of community value. If it's then on that register, communities are given first refusal to be able to put together a bid to purchase that building if it's ever come up for sale. They have 6 months to be able to do that. So that's been quite an interesting experience for us. It's meant that there are 4,000 buildings that have now been registered as a community asset. People proudly display in pubs and community centres around the country this certificate which says they're an asset of community value, but it means absolutely nothing until the point that the private developer wants to sell the building. At that point, then a community organisation has 6 months to raise all the funds at market value to be able to sell it. Hardly any have gone through that process because 6 months is just not long enough to be able to put funding together, particularly in the most disadvantaged areas. Because if you think about, if you're, for example, going for independent foundation funding to get hold of an asset, trustee meetings, if they're every quarter, you might have just missed one of the meetings and then you've only got one funding cycle. So it's just a completely unrealistic time frame, which means that in practice it's hardly ever being used. So that 18-month facility, I'd like to know more about how that's going to work, because we've been pushing for a time frame similar to that in a UK context. Two of the things I just wanted to kind of talk to you about our experience, and the second one is around our experience of community hubs being involved with and working with public service delivery. So quite a lot of our members over the last 15 to 20 years have moved away from reliance on state grant funding, core funding, project funding from foundations, to delivering public services on contracts, so taking part in competitive tendering processes. It's been really of benefit to lots of our members who've been doing things anyway in this kind of very small scale often, to be able to beef up what they've been doing to enable them to use their skills and assets to stitch together lots of public sector contracts. But we're seeing now, and have been over the past few years, a trend towards more and more outsourcing of government public services at national and local level. And we're then seeing more and more scale and standardization being applied to those contracts. So maybe 10 years ago, you used to have small place-based neighborhood or village-based contracts being let for substance misuse services, for example, or family support services. You're now seeing quite large local government areas give contracts to mega outsourcing companies for 30, 40, 50 million pounds a year to cover a huge range of different services. The absolute impact of that, aside from whether you get any quality, is that no local providers, very few local providers in most areas, are able to even bid for any of those contracts, because you need to have a balance sheet, you need to have a cash flow that's commensurate with that value. So what's happened over the last few years is that we've seen great services being run at a local level suddenly being stopped. That local provider is no longer being able to bid for things, and then they have to either face the difficult situation of being a subcontractor to one of the proliferation of large outsourcing specialist companies that don't care what's happening, they just want to run services, or they don't take part in that, and actually they see some new rival organisational team set up down the road, steal all of their IP, and